my say what an enormous pleasure it is to be here today, and also thank Lloyd, who really is the person who has made this happen. It falls to me, I think, to set out some of the terms of what we're discussing today, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of healthy disagreements and discussion amongst the audience about exactly what I'm talking about, but I want to have a stab at doing that first to sort of set the parameters of the discussion. A friend of mine used to travel in Russia at the height of the communist system, and he said of several cities, including Moscow, that one of the most curious things he found about trying to find your way about was that the maps did not mark churches. These buildings in the city were the objects by which all of us, in a strange way, navigate. I mean, in Britain today, there are certainly buildings by which we navigate our cities and our landscape. And it was for him the experience of seeing an environment in which they weren't acknowledged at all that he realised just how prominent they were. For me, certainly, and those of you who read Country Life will know that I do a weekly column about parish churches, these buildings are enormously important. And I want to try and express, in what I'm saying now, exactly why that is so. I should say something, first of all, about the terms of what we're talking about, of what we mean by churches. I don't think I'm misrepresenting my fellow speakers when I say that our focus of interest today is on the contents of parish churches, first and foremost, rather than cathedrals. Speaking for myself also, slightly guiltily, my own attention is going to focus almost exclusively on the Church of England. In reality, of course, I think it's important to acknowledge that the Catholic Church and its parishes across Britain are very important too. Also, if I was giving a talk of an hour rather than 20 minutes, it would be important to contextualise the English experience with the established church or the Episcopal churches in Scotland, Wales, and in Ireland. In my mind, to my mind, they all form part of a common cultural experience. As for the word treasure, I would define this in the very broadest terms possible. And as for those who know my Country Life column, you won't be surprised to hear this. England's parish churches constitute a living patrimony without precise European parallel. Their architecture and fittings are the product of sustained patronage that in some cases demonstrably extends back over a millennium or more. They also sweep up objects that predate Christianity itself within the country. The cumulative product of this investment is a palimpsest of almost unbelievable complexity and interest. It's like the soil of a field that has been tilled for hundreds of years. It's very deep, very characterful, and it's very rich. But in discussing parish churches, I think before we engage in any detail with the contents within them, you need to acknowledge a very important tension that exists within the buildings themselves. In my opinion, parish churches, crucially, transcend all clear claims of unique ownership. As centres of religious life, they are more than just historic monuments. As village or public buildings, they are more than simply the possession of their congregations. As works of architecture and receptacles for art, they are more than just sheds for worship. And as buildings, or at least sites, of breathtaking antiquity, no one generation has unquestioned rights to do as they please with them. That said, each generation must necessarily take complete responsibility for them and can expect no help either from posterity or the past in the burden they carry. That is very unfair, but it seems to me fundamentally true. The objects these buildings contain are in many ways inextricably bound up within this Gordian knot of confused ownership. And I don't want to talk about it now because I know others are going to talk about it, but things like the Wootton St. Lawrence armour, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, this case highlights to me just the complexities fundamentally of ownership, who possesses these objects. But in parish churches, fine art and architecture combine unpredictably with the functional, the curious and the naive as a complementary backdrop to the life of the local church. And to my mind, nearly all these things, high art and low art, constitute treasures of the church. And in that definition, I don't think I in any way either debase the currency of treasure or break the meaning of the word. So my definition of treasures would include the ordinary, which is framed to make it seem extraordinary, as well as the intrinsically valuable. And I think I should say of this that people are normally very well aware of intrinsically valuable things, that is to say, things with a marketable value and accord them respect. And that awareness can also encourage, as we will hear, parishes to sell off those things that are so valuable. But by contrast to this, the invaluable, or at least the unalienable, are regularly overlooked by parishes, almost regardless of their beauty and importance. The local communities that proudly maintain churches are, reasonably enough, only concerned incidentally with their history, a few enthusiasts aside. They can also find it very hard to grasp the full significance of objects they regard as familiar, unless they do have that bullion market value. Moreover, unlike church plate, ordinary things don't need to be locked away, and they're usually easy of access. I'd like to emphasise that I think in relation to this, one of the great triumphs of the English parish church, and one of its points of uniqueness, is that really, although some churches are locked, the degree of public access that remains to these buildings at any reasonable hour is quite extraordinary. And the devotion of those people who maintain open churches in the face of all the difficulties they present, it's remarkable. And at a price of a preparatory telephone call, it seems to me you can see practically anything in an English parish church. In this particular sense, and regardless of their other qualities which I've mentioned, these buildings and their historic contents effectively form an unsung national museum. Unlike all the institutional rivals of the parish church, moreover, the church presents its contents in an everyday setting, without curators and usually without formal displays. The contents of these buildings also preserve an absolutely unrivaled authenticity of place. There are many exceptions and complications to this rule, but the contents of parish churches usually remain in the buildings they were first created for. That continuity links us directly with the distant past and those that created them. Properly interpreted, therefore, parish churches tell from thousands of local perspectives the history of the nation, its people, and their changing religious observance. You couldn't even go to the British Museum and see such a fascinating and coherent presentation. Well, why does this matter now? The answer is, I think, in part because parish churches are currently undergoing a massive and collective change as congregations modernise their interiors. In scale and significance, these transformations will have a physical impact that easily matches that of the great 19th century restorations that created many of the interiors that we are familiar with today. To posterity, the present reordering boom will be merely one more episode in the long and eventful history of these buildings. Yet, as with all moments of change, it entails real dangers to the fabrics of the churches and their contents. Outstanding amongst these dangers is the possibility that things will be neglected or even destroyed because a parish, lulled by familiarity into indifference or intoxicated by an enthusiasm for change, grossly undervalues them. What better moment, therefore, to highlight the significance and diversity of such cultural riches? I should say at the outset that I perceive nothing inherently wrong or inappropriate with such changes. Indeed, they can be very positive or even essential to the future of these buildings. One of the reasons for that, of course, is that these buildings are not just museums. Indeed, a little digression, as someone who works in country life, I'm fascinated seeing houses of all different complexions and kinds. One of the things that most strikes me about the National Trust is while it looks after its houses generally very well, it struggles to give them a raison d'etre for visitors. it tries to invent owners to re-inject what it calls life into country houses. Privately owned houses possess that life anyway, because they have owners. Well, if you turn churches into museums, you're just doing, even well-run ones, you're just recreating the problem that National Trust houses face today. They don't have life. That life is intrinsic to their future, and their furnishings must give way to the needs of life and function. I think that just kind of goes without saying, and I don't personally have a problem with that at all. If they are to succeed, these changes, however, they must be underpinned by the broad support of the community that uses the church. Expensive changes aren't going to bring a church to life. And they must be designed and executed in sympathy with the church in question. That is to say, with a keen awareness of the building's strengths and weaknesses, as well as with a sensitivity to its dignity of space and the integrity of its historic fabric and contents. In this sense, there is no universally appropriate fix for a church, such as the removal of its pews or the installation of a kitchen and a toilet. The needs of each building need to be assessed on their own terms. And the odd thing is, of course, that thriving communities can usually navigate these projects of change successfully, drawing on a wide base of experience and interest to inform the changes they make. Failing communities, however, can seriously misjudge them, mistaking the symptoms of their problems, perceived failings of the space, heating, access, or the comfort of churches for the root cause of what is really destroying their buildings. Yet acting either without support of the community or with a sense of sympathy for the church itself, they run the risk of making, often at vast expense, needless, useless, or even damaging changes to the building. Moreover, it goes without saying that removing pews, creating disabled access, or improving the heating will not in themselves reverse the fortunes of a failing congregation or a failing community. And I would actually emphasise that I think those two things go hand in hand to some degree. Churches, of course, are necessarily involved with their wider communities in a dynamic relationship. As prominent features of cities, towns, and villages, churches can't really be escaped, as I said at the beginning, though you don't obviously have to go into them. Their scale, grandeur, and their historic fittings all underline the longevity and importance of the church's commitment to the particular place in which they stand. Through the place in the local consciousness, moreover, they serve as windows into the Christian life and the community of every parish. In other words, these buildings unequivocally take the church to the community and tangibly express its role and responsibility within it. But there is, of course, another side to this relationship. The combined qualities of churches as religious, public, and historic buildings gives the whole community a stake in the church itself. Some congregations are reluctant to acknowledge this, but in fact they stand to gain enormously from it. First, because acknowledging this stake effectively locks wide open the doors of the church to the world. In addition, and no less valuable, it prevents the congregation from falling into the comfortable but very dangerous habit of talking only to its own constituency. So the church stands to benefit enormously from the sympathetic adaptation of its buildings for universal use. In return, it owes a duty to the buildings themselves. In simple terms, it does this for them. It will improve them and leave them strengthened in every crucial respect, as places of spiritual resort, as vessels of living history, and as centres of local life for future generations. Now, in some ways, I hope that nothing that I have said seems in any way controversial. Some of it might be, but the sheer value of churches, I think, is not really in debate. And in the last 5 minutes or so, what I want to do is two things. I want to quickly run through a few slides which I hope underline some of the points I've made about the breadth of interest that churches represent. And then I very briefly want to raise one or two points about the ways in which the things that I feels should be being done to preserve and protect these objects. As I've said, church treasures come in many different forms. The one that I think people are most familiar with are the financially valuable ones. Things like armour, which I show you here, or church vessels or paintings, all of which I feel absolutely certain future speakers are going to talk about. Precisely because these things are valuable, parishes think that they can realise these assets to undertake either expensive work or restoration work, or to swell their coffers in one way or another, or simply because they're worried about the security of these objects. They feel they need to get rid of them. But I think that these valuable objects often overshadow the ordinary in churches, which are really quite extraordinary. Things that have survived, often given to the building a long time ago, and which simply are preserved there, but nobody pays very much attention to them because they think they're part of the church and not significant. Obviously, there are textiles. I'll show you here St Augustine's in London with wonderful banners. It's an type of object you come across all over the country, often slightly falling to pieces. Or even Opus Anglicanum from the church in Peterborough, just framed and hung on a wall. I've mentioned before there are objects that date back before the churches and Christianity, sometimes before Christianity arrived. I show you here Gosforth, the cross in the graveyard, or this wonderful Roman funerary monument with a barbarian being trampled underfoot in Hexham Priory. There are paintings of all varieties, many of them of museum quality, that sit in our churches, often unregarded. I show you here the totally astonishing polyptych Lydia Tregoo's on your left, and of course the wonderful figure of a knight, donor from the stem of Jesse windows of the early 14th century at Lowick in Northamptonshire. Stained glass, and I speak, I suppose, as a medievalist, is painting. People often forget that. They put great prices on paintings, but they don't put great prices on stained glass. Furnishings and fittings, I don't need to describe all these things. Organs, Great Radnor on the right, and the church in Cornwall, the dedication just escapes me, with its wonderful early 20th century fittings. Tomb monuments of all dates and every shape and form. Again, I think it's important to remind ourselves that for many people who created tomb monuments before the 18th century, whereas they might have paid Gainsborough 40 guineas for a portrait, they probably spent 4 times that sum on their funeral monument. And yet the Gainsborough ends up in the National Gallery, and the tomb monument is just abandoned, and sometimes, depressingly, can even become an object for flower arrangements and things like that, or the backdrop to a crib I saw recently. But I don't think you need to go into churches to enjoy their richness and interest. I show you here, of course, again in Cornwall, on the right, Launceston, this extraordinary external carving, or at the top left, Bloomsbury Way. Many of you will recognise that church with the Lion and the Unicorn, restored, in fact, since 2000. The Lion and the Unicorn were removed and have been put back in place and recarved. That spire, of course, appears in Hogarth's view of Gin Lane, his engraving of Gin Lane, with its wonderful decorative figures. The detailing of buildings too. I show you the finial of St Mary le Bow in the city. That's a 9-foot-long golden dragon set up in the 1670s that walks and stands above all those busy commuters who probably never bothered to look up. Or St Michael Coslany in Norwich with its extraordinary napped flint work. That flint work is actually reproduced in the 19th century from another part of the building, the bit I'm actually showing you. Or fittings of every variety, from the Laudian fittings in County Durham on the left-hand side to Craik in York with its 17th century pulpit and stalls and pews. Really wonderful variety and interesting fittings. There are also obviously things that were brought to England in the 19th century. These are stalls from an Augustinian monastery in Belgium, which are moved by a wealthy rector to his church in Northamptonshire. The first time he said Christmas service in this building in about 1820, the snow fell through the open roof onto the altar, and so he set about restoring it in appropriately extravagant fashion. And then there are curiosities of almost every variety, many of which remain improperly explained. There are obviously things like maidens' garlands, objects that celebrate the death of unmarried women, that exist in a surprisingly large number of buildings, sometimes locked away in cupboards. This example, of course, is from Shropshire. But on the left-hand side, I show you what is described as a finger stocks from Ashby de la Zouche. Now, I simply cannot testify to the credibility of this identification. If you can see, there are little holes drilled in that clasping pair of wooden shutters, and apparently the holes go in and then down. And the point is that you put your fingers in, they're sort of hooked over and then locked in place, and this was a punishment for something. Whether that's actually true, people have a penchant for torture and such things. I've no idea, but that's what they are identified as, and they still survive in the church. And of course, architecture of all kinds. I've shown you, in fact, what looks like a medieval interior in Coventry on the right, but is in fact a George Scott, a brilliant vault resolving the interior of a medieval tower, and a wonderful arts and crafts interior in Sunderland. And graveyards too contain objects of enormous interest and importance, and you just can't be overlooked. Things like lich gates and also tomb monuments. But perhaps most sort of obviously of all, the churches themselves, as I again stated at the beginning, sit in the landscapes and countryside of England and Britain as they feel like eternal elements of that landscape. And they are incredibly important and much loved features of the landscape and cityscapes and townscapes that we know. Finally, in this little run-through, I'd just like to point out that people are, of course, still adding to these buildings. I'm showing you here a painting in Norfolk, completed last year, for last Christmas, and also a tympanum carved for the millennium from Herefordshire. You may or may not like these objects, but parish churches are still acquiring, often at great expense, works of art, besides many other things. So, what do we have to do to deal with these riches and make sure they are looked after for the future? Now, I have just 2 minutes, so I'm going to just compress what I have to say into those 2 minutes. I have to crow a little bit, because I put together this slide presentation yesterday, and one of the points I wanted to make was that there needed to be a much clearer voice in sort of honesty internally within the Church of England about its management of historic buildings. And I was going to give this as an example. On the 3rd of December last year, the Church Commissioners announced with this statement of a paragraph the proposed movement of the Bishop of Bath and Wells from the palace in which he had stayed for 800 years. That seems to me to be a catastrophe of public relations and internal management. I'm incredibly smugly delighted to be able to announce that yesterday the Archbishop's Council reversed this decision and said that the objection written by the Dean and by the diocese to this move was to be upheld. The Bishop was to remain in this building. What, unfortunately, I cannot announce is that the Church Commissioners they may have had their noses rubbed in it, but I don't actually see for the future any promise of them behaving with any greater degree of honesty or openness than they have in the past. They need to undergo a cultural revolution, and that, unfortunately, I think, is still in waiting. But even so, on my little dunghill, I would love to crow. In addition to this, I think we need to acknowledge that the modern world is busy eroding some of the critical props to the status quo of churches as they presently exist. And this should concern us, and we need to think about what's going to happen. Specific mention, I think, needs to be made to two particular issues. The first is the increasing professionalisation of the world. The many benefits it brings are offset by the problem that financial thresholds and informalities of use are being squeezed out of churches. This should concern us. We need to preserve that kind of flexibility of use that will keep these churches operating for the future. The second thing is that, and I say this without any malice, but I am aware already that my own retirement is probably going to be a great deal shorter and less prosperous than the retirement of many people in the present generation. Their contribution to the heritage industry of all time, of all types, has been enormous. And for the future, I think we must be genuinely worried that there is going to be less money and less time available for people to look after these buildings. The final thing that I would like to say is that the churches themselves, and I feel this strongly, I suppose, partly through the work that I'm doing for Country Life week by week, looking at church treasures, is I can't help feeling that though churches are very much loved, we're still not very good at actually knowing about them and finding out enough about them. I think the issue of the need for church guides, for more authoritative study, for wider terms of reference is absolutely crucial to ensuring that when changes happen to these buildings, they don't end up destroying the wrong things. It's a very difficult thing to see how this problem in some ways can be overcome, because it seems to me that the ability to see, I mustn't say that, it seems to me that there is a real limit on the expertise available to parishes at present to engage in a technical sense with the historic material they have around them. It's very easy for an outsider like myself to go and say, oh gosh, look at that, what a really interesting poor box, or something like that. And then they tend to be very surprised. London exhibitions, indeed, have been very important, certainly for the medieval contents of churches, for making parishes realise that a screen or a tomb is not just a familiar object, but something genuinely of national or even international significance. That needs to happen much more. And as part of that, I feel that it's very important that people develop friends groups for their churches as a way of bridging the congregation and the community outside. Also, that they take great care before they initiate projects to speak to as many other people as they humanly can before they commit themselves and nail their colours to the mast. Nailing the colours to the mast before you have done that is simply a recipe for future unhappiness and controversy. Thank you very much.